On Saturday, May 14, 1983, at precisely 16:42 hours, a folding table positioned along the side yard of a suburban residence was shifted several inches toward a wooden fence and then returned to its original alignment less than 1 minute later. The movement was subtle, functionally unnecessary, and carried out with measured deliberation. At that moment, it attracted no attention. Children ran across the lawn, moving between a plastic playset and the patio. Music from a small battery-operated cassette player drifted unevenly in the afternoon breeze. Disposable cups rattled lightly on a table. No conversation halted, no gaze lingered on the action, and no one later recalled it occurring. The house itself was part of a curved residential street constructed during the early 1970s, a planned development situated on the outskirts of a mid-sized American city. The neighborhood followed a strict uniformity. Homes were nearly identical in size and shape, with attached garages, narrow side yards, and consistent setbacks from a street. Driveways ran directly to the garage, providing a clean line from curb to entrance. Side fences varied slightly in material and height, but primarily served as boundary markers rather than privacy measures. Streets looped inward, terminating in cul-de-sacs that minimized through traffic and limited the intrusion of unfamiliar vehicles. Residents had established familiarity with one another's routines, largely because the physical layout reinforced repeated observation of movement patterns over time. Weekends adhered to a predictable cadence. Saturday mornings were devoted to yard maintenance and household errands. Early afternoons carried a quiet lull, marked by sporadic activity. Late afternoons, typically between 15:30 and 1800 hours, were often reserved for social obligations, such as small gatherings or informal visits between neighbors. Noise levels would spike briefly when children played or vehicles arrived, then recede as the day progressed. This rhythm repeated consistently from week to week. The birthday party that afternoon fit seamlessly within these expectations, appearing as a routine communal event rather than an unusual occurrence. The birthday party celebrated the 7th birthday of a child residing 2 houses down from the observer's home. Invitations were delivered by hand earlier in the week, directed toward immediate neighbors and a small number of classmates. Attendance was informal. Guests arrived in a staggered manner to avoid congestion. Folding chairs were arranged around the yard perimeter shortly after 15:30 hours. Coolers and baskets were positioned in shaded areas to preserve food and beverages. Items intended for the children, such as wrapped gifts and small decorations, were placed in designated spots near the patio. The observer arrived at approximately 16:05 hours, entering through a side gate that remained open throughout the gathering. His route was habitual, reflecting established patterns rather than conscious planning. He walked past 3 neighboring houses, crossed 1 driveway, and entered the yard at the same location he had used for prior gatherings. His presence was expected, unremarkable, and largely invisible to the adults engaged in social conversation. He greeted the host briefly, then positioned himself near the edge of the yard, where he typically stood during such events. Professionally, the observer worked in a technical field emphasizing process, precision, and adherence to routine. His work required attention to incremental detail and repetitive verification of small-scale systems. The skills cultivated in his profession extended into his personal life. Observation was unconscious, habitual, and continuous. He noticed patterns, anomalies, and small inconsistencies not because of training in intelligence or surveillance, but because deviation from repetition stood out naturally within his daily experience. The neighbor living adjacent to the birthday party property arrived at approximately 16:31 hours. His appearance was subtle and brief, drawing no immediate attention. He entered from the rear of his own property rather than using the shared front pathway. He walked along the fence lined briefly before entering the yard. He carried no visible objects, announced nothing, and maintained a neutral posture throughout his brief presence. He remained near the periphery of the gathering, avoiding central locations where conversation and activity were concentrated. His behavior was consistent with previous limited appearances at neighborhood events. He typically avoided prolonged participation, seldom engaged children directly, and generally left after short intervals. That afternoon followed this pattern precisely. He exchanged minimal acknowledgement with the host and did not participate in any extended social interaction. At 16:42 hours, he approached a folding table near the fence. The table held unopened paper goods, napkins, and other disposable items intended for the children. The neighbor adjusted the table slightly, shifting it a few inches along the concrete surface. No objects were removed or added. No apparent operational purpose was served by the adjustment. The act lasted less than 1 minute before he returned to the yard's perimeter. The observer noticed the movement solely because it intersected his line of sight. He did not record it, comment on it, or attribute meaning. Folding tables were often adjusted during gatherings, and participants frequently moved through shared spaces without obvious purpose. The action merged seamlessly into the ambient motion of the event and remained largely invisible. The neighborhood environment reinforced benign inattention. Residents recognized and internalized one another's routines without deliberate scrutiny. Trash bins were placed consistently at the curb. Vehicles left and returned according to predictable windows. Mail delivery and other services followed scheduled patterns. Deviations were interpreted as ordinary variations caused by work obligations, visits, or seasonal fluctuations. Small irregularities rarely prompted suspicion or commentary. In the weeks prior to the party, the neighbor exhibited nothing that would have raised concern. His property maintenance was consistent and typical. Vehicle usage patterns appeared irregular but defensible. Deliveries were infrequent and normal. Visitors were rare and brief. Employment schedules suggested variable hours, but provided no visible signs of covert activity. On the surface, his behavior aligned entirely with expectations of a private, law-abiding suburban resident. After adjusting the table, the neighbor departed from the yard along the same path he had entered, returning to his own property. He remained indoors for the remainder of the evening. The party continued uninterrupted. Children alternated between activities, food was served, and social interactions continued along predictable lines. Chairs were folded and decorations removed as the event wound down. By early evening, the yard returned to its typical state. The folding table stood in its adjusted position, bearing no evidence of the brief intervention. The observer departed shortly after 1800 hours, retracing his habitual route home. He passed the neighbor's property again, noting nothing beyond normal household lights. The day concluded without incident, discussion, or reflection. The minor table adjustment went unnoticed and unremarked. In later analysis, federal investigators would reconstruct the birthday party minute by minute, identifying it as a subtle point of convergence rather than an immediate trigger for action. Intelligence exposure frequently intersects ordinary life precisely because routine provides cover. The significance of the afternoon lay not in the actions themselves, but in the larger patterns they eventually revealed. Observers within such patterns often perceive only fragments, which gain meaning only retrospectively when linked to broader investigative work. For the observer, the birthday party was an ordinary suburban event characterized by predictable rhythms, familiar faces, and minor logistical adjustments. Nothing at the time suggested the presence of surveillance, clandestine operations, or foreign influence. The folding table remained quietly in place, indistinguishable from countless similar objects across the neighborhood. The brief adjustment carried no immediate consequence, lying dormant until viewed within the context of patterns that would later emerge, marking the intersection of ordinary domestic life and clandestine activity. The neighborhood resumed its normal pace, unaware that a subtle irregularity had occurred, and that the first fragment of a broader investigative narrative had been recorded in plain sight. The days following the birthday party passed without incident, yet subtle irregularities began to emerge. Between May 15th and May 21st, 1983, the observer noted patterns in the neighbor's behavior that deviated from the previously established baseline. These observations occurred during routine movement through the neighborhood, primarily during early morning commutes and evening returns. On May 15th at 7:12 hours, the neighbor's vehicle departed from his driveway 5 minutes earlier than expected. On May 17th at 18:45 hours, it returned 10 minutes later than the approximate expected time. Alone, these deviations would have been inconsequential, yet cumulatively, they suggested variation outside of ordinary explanation. The observer, trained in recognizing consistency through his professional work, began cataloging these deviations mentally, noting times, directions, and sequences of movement. By May 18th, the observer maintained a discrete record of these occurrences. Small entries documented the neighbor's departure times, apparent destinations, and duration of absences. No speculation accompanied the notes. The observer adhered strictly to empirical observation. On May 18th at 8:03 hours, the neighbor left home, traveled in an unremarkable sedan, and returned at 8:45 hours. On May 19th at 17:57 hours, the neighbor left again, traversing a route that included a brief stop at a convenience store 5 blocks from home. The stop appeared ordinary. No packages were visible. No exchanges occurred in plain sight. Yet, in the context of repeated minor deviations, the observer began to recognize a pattern worthy of continued attention. The observer's initial approach was non-intrusive. Observations occurred from standard walking routes and public vantage points. He did not confront the neighbor, enter private property, or otherwise disrupt routines. Notes were maintained in a small notebook organized by date, time, and sequence of observed activity. Each record contained environmental conditions, including weather, visibility, and pedestrian or vehicle traffic. On May 20th at 16:18 hours, he observed the neighbor walk along the side yard, briefly pausing near the fence bordering the street before continuing toward the front yard. The behavior seemed innocuous, yet it mirrored the subtle positioning noted during the birthday party. The observer recorded it as a minor anomaly without assigning significance. A repeated pattern became increasingly apparent between May 21st and May 24th. The neighbor frequently adjusted items in the yard, small objects, furniture, or garden implements, in a manner that seemed unnecessary. Observations occurred at different times of day: early morning at 7:30 hours, mid-afternoon at 15:45 hours, and late evening at 20:10 hours. Each adjustment involved a brief, deliberate movement, followed by immediate withdrawal from view. No social interaction accompanied these actions. The observer, experienced in routine analysis, recognized that the timing, frequency, and uniformity of these micro-adjustments deviated from normative suburban behavior, creating a subtle but consistent signal. On May 22nd, at approximately 18:22 hours, the neighbor left the property carrying a small, unidentifiable object. The observer could not determine the contents, but noted its dimensions, weight, and the manner in which it was carried. The neighbor proceeded along the street for roughly 90 seconds before disappearing from view behind a row of parked vehicles. The movement was deliberate, calculated, and unlike any previously observed pedestrian activity in the neighborhood. The observer recorded the time, route, and environmental conditions, maintaining strict neutrality and avoiding interpretation beyond observable facts. Cumulative records began revealing synchronized behaviors relative to neighborhood events. The neighbor's movements often corresponded with the departure or arrival of other vehicles, the presence of mail carriers, or the scheduled collection of trash. On May 23rd at 7:48 hours, he exited during the weekly garbage pickup, returning 15 minutes later. On May 24th at 18:05 hours, he left just prior to the scheduled arrival of a delivery van. The observer's documentation focused on these synchronizations without speculation, maintaining an analytical perspective consistent with procedural investigation standards. By May 25th, the observer decided to increase the precision of his monitoring. While remaining within public sight, he began noting more detailed parameters: gait, posture, hand positioning, vehicle usage, and interactions with environmental objects. These parameters were recorded systematically. On May 25th at 17:14 hours, he observed the neighbor pause at the base of the fence for 23 seconds, then return indoors. The notation included precise seconds, angles of movement, and visual identifiers. Every recorded detail reinforced the methodical approach, ensuring observations were defensible if later reviewed by formal investigators. The observer's internal analysis involved pattern comparison. Prior behaviors were juxtaposed with current observations, emphasizing deviations in timing, frequency, and repetition. Minor adjustments to objects, variations in departure and return, and subtle differences in pedestrian posture were cataloged. The observer noted that deviations rarely occurred during communal events, suggesting that irregular activity was concentrated during periods of low visibility. This insight emerged solely from empirical observation and chronological documentation. By May 26, 2 weeks after the birthday party, a framework of anomalies had taken shape. The neighbor's behavior included 1. Recurrent micro-adjustments of yard objects. 2. Precise departures and returns correlated with minor neighborhood events. 3. Brief, unexplained journeys along specific streets. And 4. Repetitive timing deviations compared with his previously established schedule. Each anomaly, individually, could be explained by benign factors. Together, they indicated a pattern sufficiently irregular to warrant continued, disciplined observation. On May 27 at 8:07 hours, the neighbor departed for an approximately 45-minute trip along a route not previously observed. The observer traced this movement from a distance, recording turns, stops, and interactions with environmental markers. The neighbor paused for 11 seconds near a mailbox clustered 2 blocks away, then continued. The observer noted the object previously carried on May 22 was not present. No exchange was visible, but the brief, precise stop suggested deliberate action. Again, the observer maintained strict factual description without interpretation. Environmental consistency was a key focus. The observer documented light conditions, temperature, and traffic patterns for each observed action. On May 28 at 17:56 hours, during late afternoon light, the neighbor conducted a minor yard adjustment, pausing exactly 21 seconds before returning indoors. On May 29 at 7:18 hours, a similar adjustment occurred under early morning light, duration measured precisely at 22 seconds. Such repetitions, both in timing and movement, strengthened the observer's perception of non-random behavior. By May 30th, the observer began synthesizing data. Written records were compiled chronologically. Anomalies were highlighted. Deviations in timing, frequency, and environmental synchronization were tabulated. The observer employed simple comparative charts to visualize patterns. This process remained analytical, neutral, and procedural, adhering to principles common in intelligence work without suggesting intent or labeling behavior as illicit. The aim was identification of reproducible irregularity, not attribution of motive. The observer also began passive anticipatory positioning. During daily commutes, he adjusted walking routes to intersect with likely paths of the neighbor without engaging or alerting him. Observations focused on public areas and visible property boundaries. Notes included precise timestamps, vehicle makes and models, observable objects, and interactions with environmental factors. At all times, care was taken to avoid interference or confrontation. Patterns continued to accumulate into June. On June 1st at 18:11 hours, the neighbor departed for an approximately 32-minute period, reappearing with no visible object. On June 2nd at 7:09 hours, he conducted a routine adjustment of lawn furniture, pausing precisely 19 seconds. Each instance was added to the chronological record. By June 3rd, the observer had constructed a dataset consisting of 22 independent observations over 3 weeks. The repetition and synchronization of movements, combined with otherwise ordinary appearance, suggested a hidden operational rhythm, subtle and consistent. The observer's approach throughout this period remained disciplined. Notes were factual, concise, and devoid of narrative embellishment. Observations were cross-referenced with environmental conditions, known neighborhood schedules, and any observable deviations from baseline patterns. The neighbor's behavior had not escalated into overtly suspicious or criminal acts. The irregularities were notable for precision, consistency, and repetition. At this stage, the observer maintained strict neutrality, documenting only empirically verifiable deviations. By June 4th, it became evident that a subtle, repeated pattern existed. The neighbor's movements and adjustments, minor in isolation, aggregated into a detectable signal. No single act justified intervention. The cumulative observations, however, warranted continued, structured monitoring. The observer's records now contain timestamps for 24 separate events, detailing durations, paths, object interactions, and environmental conditions. These records formed the procedural foundation for any future investigative action. The section closes with recognition that ordinary routines intersected with subtle anomalies. Suspicion had not yet escalated to accusation or direct engagement. Instead, it emerged as a methodical accumulation of empirical evidence, structured to maintain accuracy and neutrality. The observer's actions demonstrated how civilians, through disciplined attention to routine, can detect deviations that may later correlate with clandestine activity. The pattern, subtle and quiet, remained under observation, poised to initiate escalation only when corroborated by additional evidence or federal involvement. By June 5, 1983, the observer had accumulated 3 weeks of systematically recorded observations. The neighbor's pattern of micro-adjustments, precise departures and returns, and synchronizations with environmental markers suggested a non-random sequence. On this date, during a routine observation from the street sidewalk at 1736 hours, the neighbor exited his property carrying a small, unidentifiable object. Unlike prior occurrences, the observer noted subtle concealment behavior. The object was held close to the torso, partially obscured by a rolled-up newspaper. The neighbor moved toward the street, pausing momentarily at the curb before continuing along a predetermined path toward a row of parked vehicles approximately 50 meters away. The observer documented the movement, precise duration of the stop, ambient light conditions, and the positioning of the object. No interaction with other individuals occurred. The observer's decision-making process shifted subtly following this incident. Whereas previous actions were recorded and cataloged purely as anomalies, this event introduced the potential for tangible evidence of deliberate behavior. The observer refrained from interference, but recognized the need to document systematically, enhancing the granularity of data. Observations now included gait, hand orientation, object concealment, and environmental factors, all logged with timestamps and precise duration measurements. The methodology mirrored procedural intelligence documentation, though conducted by a civilian with no formal training in counterintelligence. Later the same day, at 18:01 hours, the neighbor returned from the brief excursion, placing the object, still partially obscured, on a side ledge behind a hedge. The observer did not approach or retrieve the item, maintaining an ethical boundary within private property limits. Instead, he recorded its position, dimensions, approximate weight, and concealment method. The act itself lasted 39 seconds, captured entirely through observational inference rather than physical interaction. This moment represented the first confirmed instance of physical evidence, however indirect, that could be linked to an underlying operational pattern. On June 6th at 7:14 hours, the neighbor departed again along a similar route. The observer recorded the time, direction, and duration of travel. Environmental conditions were included, with notes on lighting, traffic, and pedestrian activity. At 7:27 hours, the neighbor paused near a mailbox cluster 2 blocks away. While no exchange was visible, the stop mirrored the prior day's behavior in spatial positioning, duration, and object concealment. The observer continued to refrain from speculation, focusing solely on measurable variables. Seconds elapsed, angles of movement, and relative positioning. The cumulative dataset prompted the observer to contact formal authorities. On June 7th at 9:32 hours, he initiated a call to the local field office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He relayed factual observations without conjecture, providing dates, times, locations, and detailed behavioral descriptions. The report emphasized repeated, consistent anomalies and the presence of a potentially concealed object during at least one documented excursion. The observer submitted copies of written logs and charts summarizing patterns across multiple days. No assumptions regarding motive or affiliation were made. The communication was strictly procedural and factual. Federal agents reviewed the submission within 24 hours. By June 8, case intake procedures had begun. The observer was formally interviewed, during which he verified each recorded observation, timing, and environmental condition. Interviews were procedural, structured to ensure accuracy and corroboration. Agents employed standardized intake forms, documenting the chain of information from the civilian observer to federal processing. Physical evidence was not transferred at this stage. The focus was on behavioral documentation and reproducibility of observation. On June 9 at 1648 hours, under procedural guidance, the observer conducted a controlled, low-risk return to observation points near the neighbor's property. Agents instructed him to focus on publicly observable areas, to continue precise timing of departures and returns, and to document any object movement or environmental changes. Observations at 1650 and 1702 hours revealed minor yard adjustments consistent with previous patterns. Each action was logged, including duration, angle of adjustment, and relative placement of objects. These continued patterns reinforced the hypothesis that the neighbor engaged in repeated, deliberate, and structured behavior potentially associated with clandestine activity. On June 10 at 8:05 hours, agents deployed initial surveillance assets in a non-intrusive manner. Vehicles were positioned at publicly accessible vantage points, maintaining visual contact while avoiding detection. Observers noted departure times, routes, and stops in real time, replicating the precision employed by the civilian observer. Observations were cross-referenced with the observer's prior logs. At 8:18 hours, the neighbor conducted a yard adjustment lasting 24 seconds. The consistency between civilian and federal observation corroborated previous documentation. By June 11th, patterns suggested potential operational tradecraft. Brief, deliberate movements, precise timing, and object concealment indicated methods consistent with dead-drop techniques known in intelligence procedures. Agents emphasized descriptive analysis over assumption of intent. The neighbor's actions remained observable within legal parameters, and no direct intervention was authorized. Environmental synchronization, such as adjusting behavior around postal delivery or trash collection, was noted, suggesting operational awareness without overt visibility. On June 12 at 1739 hours, a critical incident occurred. The neighbor exited his property carrying an unidentifiable item partially concealed beneath a rolled magazine. The observer and federal surveillance teams simultaneously recorded the movement. The neighbor paused near a hedge at 1742 hours, placing the object briefly on the ground, then continuing along the street. Agents noted the pause lasted exactly 38 seconds. Environmental conditions, including lighting, traffic, and pedestrian presence, were documented. The observation provided a tangible link between prior behavioral patterns and potentially actionable material evidence. Following this incident, agents coordinated retrieval of the object. At 1744 hours, one surveillance officer safely retrieved the item from its concealment point. Initial inspection revealed a folded envelope with microfilm-like contents, consistent with known clandestine methods. Evidence was immediately cataloged, placed into secure containment, and entered into chain of custody documentation. Every step, from observation to retrieval, was logged with exact timestamps, location coordinates, and handling procedure, ensuring procedural integrity and legal admissibility. June 13th marked the first formal interviews of the neighbor. Agents approached the subject under controlled conditions. Initial questioning was procedural, confirming personal and occupational details while noting discrepancies with prior observed behaviors. Interviews adhered to federal protocols. Questions were precise, responses documented verbatim, and the chain of documentation verified against prior logs. The neighbor's explanations were inconsistent with observed patterns, further reinforcing the significance of accumulated data. At this stage, motives remained unassigned. The analysis focused strictly on corroboration of observable behaviors. Over the next several days, agents compiled and cross-referenced all observational and physical evidence. Documentation included 1. Departure and return times. 2. Micro-adjustments of yard objects. 3. Duration and concealment methods of carried items. 4. Environmental synchronization relative to neighborhood events. And 5. Recovered material artifacts. The accumulation of these records established a reproducible pattern of deliberate activity that exceeded ordinary behavior, providing sufficient grounds for further operational consideration. No intervention was taken beyond surveillance and evidence documentation at this stage. By June 17, federal investigators recognized the presence of a structured but partially obscured operational sequence. While the neighbor remained legally within his rights to conduct private actions, the cumulative evidence suggested potential association with clandestine activity. Agents emphasized empirical documentation, precision timing, and replication of civilian observations. Observed behaviors were compared against known intelligence tradecraft, including dead drop concealment, route repetition, and environmental awareness. Throughout the process, the civilian observer remained a critical asset. His meticulous records, chronological notes, and precise timing logs provided initial verification and independent corroboration of federal surveillance. The observer's neutral, disciplined documentation enabled agents to validate patterns without reliance on circumstantial interpretation. By maintaining strict factual reporting, the observer established a procedural foundation essential for subsequent operational steps, including potential surveillance expansion and controlled interaction with the subject. The section closes with recognition that intervention had progressed from passive civilian observation to structured federal assessment. The observer's records had initiated procedural escalation, enabling agents to document, verify, and secure evidence consistent with intelligence tradecraft protocols. Suspicion, grounded in methodical observation, had transformed into empirically supported investigation. While the neighbor's intent remained unconfirmed, the federal process ensured that any action taken would rest on precise, verifiable evidence. At this stage, the situation remained contained, observable, and legally defensible, establishing the operational threshold for subsequent surveillance, analysis, and potential interrogation. On June 18, 1983, federal surveillance operations entered a more structured phase. Agents deployed multiple teams to monitor the neighbor continuously from publicly accessible vantage points. Each surveillance team maintained staggered positions, ensuring uninterrupted coverage while avoiding detection. Vehicles were parked on side streets, several blocks removed from the target residence, and observers utilized binoculars and unobtrusive note-taking equipment. Field logs included precise timestamps for every departure, pause, and return. At 7:02 hours, Team Alpha recorded the neighbor leaving his property along a route previously documented by the civilian observer. Team Bravo verified the same movement from a separate angle, confirming consistency across observation posts. By June 19th at 7:18 hours, synchronized logs indicated a repeated micro-adjustment within the side yard. The neighbor shifted a small garden ornament by 12 inches and returned indoors after 22 seconds. Surveillance teams recorded duration, object type, and angle of movement. The repetition aligned with prior patterns, confirming the predictability of operational behavior. Agents noted the precision in timing, as the movement occurred nearly simultaneously with the scheduled arrival of a postal carrier along the street. Environmental factors, including shadows, pedestrian traffic, and ambient noise, were documented for later comparison. On June 20th at 16:47 hours, a controlled observation of a suspected dead drop location was initiated. The neighbor exited the property carrying a small, rectangular object partially concealed within a folded newspaper. Agents noted precise seconds of travel, stops, and placement of the object. At 16:50 hours, he paused at a predetermined bush near the sidewalk, placing the object momentarily on the ground before continuing along his route. Agents recorded the duration of the pause, exactly 37 seconds, environmental conditions, and object placement coordinates. This sequence mirrored previous observations from both the civilian logs and earlier federal surveillance, reinforcing the reproducibility of behavioral patterns. Surveillance logs from June 21st to June 23rd reflected consistent operational methods. The neighbor repeatedly conducted brief yard adjustments, maintained precise timing during departures, and executed minor object placements corresponding to low-traffic intervals. Each movement was meticulously documented, including duration to the nearest second, distance traveled, and relative positioning to environmental markers. Surveillance analysts cross-referenced civilian records with agent field notes, constructing a comprehensive behavioral map. The combination of repeated micro-adjustments, concealed object placement, and synchronized environmental awareness suggested a deliberate operational sequence, consistent with known tradecraft techniques. By June 24th, federal analysts identified the neighbor as a potential intelligence asset engaged in dead drop operations. Operational patterns included 1. Recurrent micro-adjustments of yard objects. 2. Precise timing of departures and returns. 3. Temporary concealment of small items in public view. 4. Synchronization with external environmental markers. And 5. Repetition of routes previously documented. Analysts emphasized the importance of maintaining empirical observation, avoiding conjecture about intent, and ensuring all evidence was reproducible and verifiable. Surveillance teams maintained continuous coverage, adjusting positions to account for natural deviations in the neighbor's movements while remaining within legal observational boundaries. On June 25th at 8:01 hours, a controlled dead drop retrieval was executed. Agents observed the neighbor depart with a small, concealed object and monitored his route to a previously identified location behind a low hedge. At 8:05 hours, the object was retrieved by surveillance personnel, recorded, and placed into secure evidence containment. Photographic documentation, precise measurements, and chain of custody logs were completed. The retrieved item included microfilm encased within a folded envelope, consistent with established clandestine exchange methods. Each procedural step adhered to federal guidelines, ensuring both legal compliance and operational integrity. By June 26th, analysts compiled a detailed operational timeline. Entries included every departure, pause, adjustment, and object placement, with duration recorded to the nearest second. Vehicle movements, pedestrian traffic, environmental conditions, and line-of-sight obstacles were annotated. Analysts noted recurring patterns correlating to neighborhood schedules, including postal delivery, garbage collection, and peak pedestrian movement. The consistency reinforced the initial identification of the neighbor as an asset operating under structured behavioral constraints. Interrogation preparation began concurrently with continued surveillance. The objective was to acquire confirmation of asset status, operational methods, and potential external handlers while maintaining legal procedural safeguards. Agents assembled evidence packets, summarized observational data, and prepared questioning frameworks consistent with federal counterintelligence protocols. The neighbor remained unaware of the full extent of federal attention, allowing uninterrupted observation to continue for corroboration prior to direct engagement. On June 27th at 17:32 hours, the neighbor conducted a routine micro-adjustment followed by an object placement at a previously monitored dead drop location. Agents monitored the action through unobtrusive observation posts. Timing, environmental conditions, and spatial coordinates were meticulously recorded. Surveillance teams ensured redundancy, with overlapping visual coverage from multiple angles. Each detail was verified against prior instances to establish reproducibility. The action lasted 39 seconds, consistent with prior documented durations, confirming operational consistency. Interrogation commenced on June 28th. The neighbor was approached under controlled circumstances, following established federal procedures for civil rights protection and evidentiary handling. Agents presented collected evidence and documentation of observed patterns. While the neighbor provided basic personal information, detailed admissions regarding operational activity were limited. Analysts noted that responses were consistent with prior intelligence cases in which operational motives were partially obscured and handlers remained unidentified or beyond jurisdictional reach. During interrogation, the neighbor disclosed limited information regarding recruitment, including generalized references to contact with an external entity and routine instructions for object placement. No specific identity of the handler was revealed. Operational methods included timed departures, precise micro-adjustments, and temporary concealment of items in predetermined locations. Analysts recorded methodology, chronology, and synchronization details. The handler remained partially hidden, maintaining distance through indirect communication channels, consistent with classical Cold War intelligence tradecraft. Simultaneously, surveillance continued to validate claimed behaviors against observed actions. June 29th at 8:12 hours, the neighbor executed a previously documented object placement with timing and duration consistent with reported methodology. Redundant observation confirmed adherence to procedural patterns described during interrogation. Analysts synthesized these records with prior evidence to reconstruct a comprehensive operational map detailing routes, timings, dead drop points, and object handling practices. Federal analysis identified the neighbor as a discrete intelligence asset operating under indirect instruction. While methods were consistent with known Soviet tradecraft, definitive attribution to external sources remained unconfirmed. Surveillance logs, observational data, and interrogation summaries provided sufficient detail to validate operational consistency, asset compliance, and procedural reliability. The handler's identity, location, and operational integration remained unresolved, representing a gap common in Cold War-era clandestine operations. By June 30th, surveillance extended to monitor multiple dead drop locations, timed departures, and recurring yard adjustments. Agents continued to log precise durations, object placements, environmental conditions, and route coordinates. The neighbor's adherence to structured behaviors allowed federal analysts to model operational patterns, anticipate movement, and prepare potential containment strategies. Despite extensive observation and partial admissions, the handler remained outside operational reach, reflecting ongoing ambiguity. Section 4 concludes with recognition of dual procedural tracks, continuous empirical observation, and methodical interrogation. The neighbor, identified as a cooperative but partially informative asset, demonstrated consistent operational patterns validated through repeated observation. Handlers, by design, remained partially hidden or outside jurisdiction, maintaining operational security. Empirical documentation, precise timing, and structured surveillance provided a procedural foundation for potential escalation while preserving legal and operational integrity. The Cold War operational environment remained opaque, emphasizing subtlety, verification, and procedural discipline rather than overt action or resolution. By July 1, 1983, federal analysts had compiled exhaustive records of the neighbor's operational patterns, including precise departures, micro-adjustments, object concealments, and dead drop placements. With these logs verified against independent civilian observation and continuous federal surveillance, leadership authorized a controlled sting operation. The objective was to intercept potential communication between the neighbor and an external handler, confirm the identity of the handler, and retrieve additional operational material. The operation was structured to minimize risk to personnel and maintain legality, emphasizing observation, anticipation, and procedural verification over direct confrontation. Preparation involved multiple stages. Analysts reviewed every recorded movement, identifying temporal windows when the neighbor would likely conduct object placement. Redundant surveillance positions were established along primary and secondary routes. Technical observation included visual confirmation using binoculars, photographic documentation, and synchronized timing across observation teams. Environmental variables, such as pedestrian activity, lighting, and vehicle movement, were included in planning. Each variable was logged with anticipated deviation ranges to account for natural irregularity in civilian behavior. On July 2nd at 7:12 hours, the neighbor departed his property carrying a small rectangular item, partially concealed beneath a folded newspaper. Surveillance teams noted exact duration of travel, distance to previously identified dead drop locations, and environmental conditions, including minor traffic and lighting patterns. The neighbor paused at a designated hedge at 7:15 hours, placing the item momentarily on the ground. Agents prepared to intercept or document any subsequent retrieval. Duration was precisely recorded at 37 seconds. The operation proceeded without deviation from planned methodology. Unexpectedly, at 7:16 hours, an unidentified individual approached the dead drop location from an angle outside the previously documented route. The individual's arrival was brief, controlled, and executed with deliberate awareness of the environment. Surveillance teams observed the handoff between the neighbor's deposited object and the new individual, confirming that operational control had shifted externally. The identity of this individual, assumed to be the handler, remained obscured. Agents were constrained from immediate intervention to avoid compromising operational security, risking the escape of a critical asset. The unexpected appearance of the handler initiated a procedural dilemma. Immediate physical engagement could alert the neighbor, destroy evidence, or provoke operational dispersal. Analysts opted for containment through extended observation, documenting timing, posture, movement, and interaction with environmental markers. The handoff lasted 34 seconds. Observers recorded precise distance between the neighbor and the handler, object concealment, and departure directions. While partial evidence was acquired, including photographic documentation, the handler remained unidentified, demonstrating operational security measures designed to obscure identity and minimize risk. Following the handoff, the neighbor returned to his property at 7:20 hours, performing minor yard adjustments consistent with prior patterns. These adjustments were logged with precision, including timing to the second, spatial orientation, and repetition consistency. Surveillance teams cross-referenced these movements with prior behavioral data to confirm continuity in operational adherence. Despite the partial success in observation, the inability to intercept or identify the external handler represented a significant limitation to the operation's ultimate objectives. Federal analysis of the event highlighted multiple operational constraints. The neighbor's behavior remained consistent, predictable, and procedurally verifiable. The handler's intervention introduced uncertainty, demonstrating a strategic buffer between asset and external control. Analysts documented all observable variables, including exact timings, object interactions, movement trajectories, and environmental factors. The operation's partial success yielded confirmation of ongoing clandestine activity and demonstrated empirical links between observed patterns and actual handoffs. Yet the handler's identity remained unresolved. Over the subsequent week, agents continued surveillance with emphasis on the newly identified secondary routes. The neighbor maintained previously documented behaviors, executing timed departures, object concealments, and yard micro-adjustments with near-identical precision. Observations extended to multiple dead drop sites, synchronized with neighborhood schedules, pedestrian activity, and natural environmental changes. Analysts noted that operational behavior remained consistent despite partial intervention, reinforcing the notion of disciplined tradecraft and rigorous adherence to procedural protocol by the neighbor. July 10th marked the final formal attempt to intercept the handler. Analysts coordinated surveillance positions along anticipated routes, employing redundancy, real-time communication, and observational cross-checks. At 7:14 hours, the neighbor departed, carrying a concealed item. Agents monitored the predetermined dead drop location. At 7:17 hours, the anticipated handoff failed to materialize. No external individual appeared. Surveillance teams documented the absence, timing, and environmental factors. Analysts concluded that the handler had either altered routines or exercised counter-surveillance measures, reflecting operational discretion characteristic of Cold War clandestine methods. Despite the failed sting, the neighbor's cooperation during prior interrogation and verified adherence to observable patterns provided grounds for subsequent legal action. Procedural documentation, cumulative surveillance logs, and recovered operational material enabled the initiation of formal charges against the neighbor. While legal responsibility for individual action could be established, the external handler remained outside jurisdiction. Federal records emphasized empirical evidence of behavioral irregularity, compliance with tradecraft methods, and partial admissions obtained through controlled interrogation. Court proceedings, initiated in late July, resulted in the neighbor receiving a custodial sentence for knowingly participating in clandestine exchanges and failing to disclose operational activities to authorities. Documentation included 1. Detailed logs of time departures and returns. 2. Repeated micro-adjustments of yard objects. 3. Observed concealment of material items for corroboration of surveillance data with civilian observation. And 5. Recovery of tangible operational material. Legal outcomes addressed only the actions of the identified asset. The handler, operating outside federal jurisdiction, remained unidentified and unconstrained. By late July, surveillance operations were gradually suspended. Analysts concluded that further observation would yield diminishing returns without direct access to the external handler. Remaining materials were secured, cross-referenced with prior logs, and stored for future reference. Federal debriefings emphasized lessons in operational discretion, the value of civilian observation, and the inherent limitations posed by partial visibility and jurisdictional boundaries. Analysts documented uncertainty as a central component of Cold War intelligence methodology, noting that resolution was often partial and operational clarity limited. The final reflection highlighted several unresolved threads. While the neighbor's operational pattern had been documented, verified, and partially interrupted, the external handler had eluded capture. Dead drop methods, micro-adjustments, and timing precision continued to underscore the disciplined nature of Cold War tradecraft. Observers, both civilian and federal, verified repeated patterns, yet the ultimate origin and control of operations remained concealed. Ambiguity persisted, demonstrating the enduring opacity of clandestine networks during the period. Section 5 concludes with recognition that Cold War operational environments frequently allowed partial success, while leaving critical variables unresolved. The neighbor served as a visible and documentable asset. The handler remained invisible, maintaining operational security. Federal agencies established empirical verification, procedural documentation, and legal recourse where possible, but full resolution was unattainable. The case exemplified the subtle tension between observation and action, documentation and intervention, certainty and ambiguity. Final records emphasized the limitations of knowledge, the necessity of methodical observation, and the enduring presence of unresolved Cold War secrecy.